The evening sun draped a golden haze over the hills of West Texas. Jack Rourke stood at the edge of the paddock, his weathered hat clutched in his hand, the dust swirling slowly around his boots. In front of him, a herd of horses moved lazily through the dry dirt, their coats glowing under the fading light. He'd watched sunsets like this for nearly 7 decades, but tonight felt different. Final. The kind of silence that settles in when something sacred is about to be lost. These weren't just horses, they were memories in motion. Jack had raised most of them from birth, guided their shaky legs, treated their wounds, whispered to them during storms. June, the tall mare with the white blaze on her face, stood nearest. She looked at him as if she knew. She always seemed to know more than the others. Jack reached out to touch her muzzle, but stopped halfway. His throat tightened. This was harder than he'd expected. He turned and walked back toward the barn, his joints aching with every step. Inside, the light filtered through the cracks in the old wood, drawing stripes across the floor like prison bars. He sat down on an overturned feed bucket, pulled out a worn leather notebook, and began to write. Just a few lines. Not for a person. For a horse. For whoever might see what he couldn't say out loud. He folded the paper with shaking hands and slipped it into a small pouch that once belonged to his father. Back outside, he fastened the pouch to June's saddle. The leather creaked softly as he buckled the strap, his fingers moving slowly, deliberately. The letter inside wasn't long. It didn't have to be. Just enough to carry a question. A hope. Maybe even a final act of faith. June shifted her weight and looked at him again. Jack gave her a nod, then turned away before his resolve cracked. Across the paddock, Sheriff Boyd Ellison's truck kicked up dust as it pulled in. Jack didn't turn to look. He already knew why Boyd had come. The auction was at sunrise. By this time tomorrow, the horses would be gone. Walt Hensley would make sure of that. The ranch would be empty. Quiet. And Jack. Well, Jack didn't know what would be left of himself. But somewhere deep in his gut, buried beneath the years and silence, something stirred. Like a whisper from the land itself. And in just 3 days, the thunder behind that whisper would arrive, on 400 hooves. The sun had barely cracked the horizon when Jack guided June into the back of the old trailer. The rusted latch groaned as he secured the gate. The early morning chill lingered in the air, wrapping itself around his bones. He moved slower than he used to, but there was still precision in every motion. He'd done this 1,000 times before, just never with this kind of weight in his chest. As the truck rumbled down the gravel road toward the auction grounds in Abilene, Jack kept one hand on the wheel and the other on the gearshift, eyes fixed straight ahead. He didn't play the radio. He never did. Silence, again, was his companion. The leather pouch with the note rested beneath June's saddle, unseen. He didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but that wasn't the point. It was a kind of offering. A last tether to something bigger than pride or money. The auction yard was already busy when he arrived. Dust kicked up in thick clouds as trailers pulled in one after another. Men in worn jeans and wide hats moved about, talking loudly, slapping hands, checking hooves. Walt Hensley, tall and broad-shouldered with a face half swallowed by a salt and pepper beard, spotted Jack and strode over. He wore a clipboard tucked under one arm and a forced grin under his mustache. "Didn't think you'd bring her in person," Walt said, nodding toward the trailer. Jack didn't return the smile. Had to. Couldn't just hand her off. Walt gave a shallow nod, reading the weight in Jack's eyes but choosing not to answer it. Instead, he took the reins and led June toward the holding pens. Jack followed a few steps behind, boots crunching in the dirt. He didn't look at the other horses, didn't talk to the other sellers. He just watched June walk away, each step like a thread unraveling from his chest. Inside the auction office, Grace Blevins handed Jack a clipboard. Her eyes softened when they met his. "Hard day, Mr. Rourke," she said gently. Jack nodded, signing without looking up. "Not the first," he murmured, "but maybe the last." He left before the bidding started. He didn't want to hear the numbers. He didn't want to know who took June home, or what they'd use her for. He drove back in silence, dust trailing behind him like a ghost. As the ranch came into view, it felt emptier already, the fence lines stretching like open wounds against the morning sky. He had no idea that someone was already reading the note, and they weren't the only ones heading his way. The wind swept across the open pens at the auction yard, carrying the scent of dust, sweat, and hay. Nora Whitlow stood by the mare, her gloved hand brushing gently down June's neck. She hadn't expected to see Jack's name on the intake list that morning. And when she saw June, the mare she'd helped deliver 15 years ago, it was like being pulled back into a memory she hadn't meant to revisit. June nudged Nora's arm softly, as if trying to speak without words. That's when Nora noticed the pouch. The old leather was cracked, worn with time, and tied neatly beneath the saddle. Curious, she untied the strap, slipped the folded paper out, and read it slowly, twice. It wasn't long. Jack had never been a man of many words, but what he wrote was enough to make her heart pause. If she ends up with someone kind, tell them she knows the sound of a harmonica and the meaning of loyalty. She was never just a horse. I raised her like blood. If you're reading this, maybe you can do what I couldn't anymore. Give her a life with purpose. I'm sorry. J.R. Nora stood still for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. She hadn't spoken to Jack in years, not since they had drifted apart like so many people do. Slowly, without cause, until one day it's too far to fix. But the man who wrote this letter wasn't just tired, he was broken. And something in those few lines tugged at her more than she wanted to admit. She walked back into the auction office and found Grace Blevins behind the desk, sorting papers. Nora laid the letter on the counter. "Did he talk to anyone before dropping her off?" Nora asked. Grace shook her head slowly. "Didn't say much. Looked like a man laying something to rest." Nora folded the letter again, slower this time. There was something else in it, between the lines, a quiet plea. Not just to care for June, but to see something bigger. She looked out across the holding pens, where dozens of horses shifted anxiously in the morning light. She thought about driving out to Jack's ranch. Thought about what she'd even say if she did. But she didn't move. Not yet. Not until the call came that night, from the sheriff's office, with a report so strange it made her blood run cold. The call came just after midnight. Nora Whitlow was sitting in her kitchen, a cup of coffee gone cold between her hands, when her phone lit up. She didn't recognize the number at first, but when she answered and heard Sheriff Boyd Ellison's low, steady voice, her heart tightened. "Nora, I wouldn't bother you this late if it weren't something strange," he said. "You might want to come out to the Rourke place." She didn't ask questions. 20 minutes later, headlights cut through the darkness along the gravel road leading to Jack's ranch. The air felt heavier than usual, like the land itself was holding its breath. As she pulled up near the front gate, her eyes widened. They were everywhere. Dozens, no hundreds, of horses stood silently across the property. Some grazed. Others simply stared into the night, as if waiting for something. The open pastures, usually quiet and barren this time of year, now pulsed with life. The sound of hooves shifting in the soil was like distant thunder rolling across the earth. Sheriff Ellison stood near the fence line, arms crossed, face unreadable. "They came out of nowhere," he said as she stepped out of her truck. "One of my deputies spotted them around 11. No trailers, no tracks, not a single broken fence. They're just here." Nora's breath caught. This many horses? No one noticed them traveling. Ellison shook his head. "You ever seen anything like it?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes scanned the crowd, and then there she was, June, standing near the barn, calm and still. The leather pouch was gone. Nora felt something unspoken pass between them, something that had no words. As if June had led them here. As if this wasn't random at all. She took a few cautious steps toward the mare, brushing her hand once again along that familiar white blaze. June didn't flinch. Instead, she turned her head toward the hills, toward the north pasture Jack hadn't used in years. "What is this?" Nora whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Ellison exhaled slowly. "I don't know. But I think we better ask Jack before the sun comes up." Nora looked toward the ranch house, dark and quiet in the distance. A lump formed in her throat. She hadn't stood this close to that porch in nearly 20 years. But something was calling them both back. And by morning, Jack Rourke would have to face a truth he'd buried deeper than the bones of his land. Jack hadn't slept. He'd watched from the porch as the first shapes emerged beyond the tree-line, barely visible in the moonlight. At first, he thought he was dreaming, or hallucinating. But then came the sounds. Hooves, dozens at first, then hundreds. Horses. Everywhere. They moved like a tide across the fields, not in panic, but with strange purpose. Like they knew where they were going. He stood silently, arms crossed, as Sheriff Ellison and Nora parked their trucks. Jack didn't wave. Didn't call out. He just watched. June had returned. She stood at the head of the herd like a ghost returning home. For a moment, Jack felt a tightness in his chest, so sudden and deep it nearly brought him to his knees. Nora approached first. She stopped at the foot of the porch steps, unsure if she should come closer. The last time they'd stood this close years ago, neither of them had said what needed to be said. But tonight, words felt smaller than what was happening. "You knew they'd come," she said softly. Jack didn't answer right away. He looked out over the land, the horses scattered across it like pieces of a broken past suddenly reassembling themselves. "I didn't know," he said finally. "But I hoped." Sheriff Ellison joined them, boots heavy on the wooden steps. "Where the hell did they come from, Jack? This many horses don't just appear." Jack rubbed a hand across his face, his voice low and distant. "Years ago, I let some of 'em go. Couldn't afford to feed 'em anymore. Turned 'em loose in the canyon. Figured I was setting them free. Maybe they survived. Maybe they multiplied. I don't know. But June was one of the last to leave. And I guess she found them." Nora looked out to the distant hills, where the north pasture faded into brush and canyon. "There's something else, isn't there?" she asked. Jack hesitated, then nodded. "That pasture, they always avoided it. Horses, cattle, everything. My father said it was cursed. I never believed that. But there's something buried out there. Something I never told anyone." He stepped down from the porch, shoulders heavier than they'd ever been. The horses began to stir, almost in response. June turned and walked slowly toward the edge of the pasture. Jack followed her. And for the first time in decades, the gate to the north pasture creaked open. The gate to the north pasture hadn't been opened in over 30 years. The rusted hinges groaned like something waking from a long sleep. Jack stepped through first, the tall grass brushing against his boots, each step slower than the last. Nora followed closely behind, her eyes moving across the field with the caution of someone entering sacred ground. Behind them, Sheriff Ellison stayed quiet, hand resting on his belt, eyes sharp. June walked ahead, steady and calm, guiding the way as if she'd done it 100 times. The other horses kept their distance, staying just beyond the fence, as if even they knew this place held a different kind of silence. About 50 yards in, the land dipped slightly, forming a shallow basin. Jack stopped there. His breath caught. The soil here looked different, darker, disturbed. He hadn't been here since he was a much younger man, back when the weight of his family's legacy had started to suffocate him. "My father made me swear never to speak of it," Jack said, voice barely above a whisper. "Said some things weren't meant to be remembered." Nora glanced at him. "What happened here, Jack?" He swallowed hard, hands clenched into fists at his sides. "There was a flood in '63. Washed out part of the canyon. We found bones. Not just animals. There were bridles, tools, evidence of something older. Maybe a burial ground. Maybe worse. My father had it filled in. Told the hands never to ride near it again." The wind picked up, and the grass around them moved like a whispering crowd. June lowered her head to the earth, pawed at the dirt once, then stepped back. "I always thought it was just superstition," Jack continued. "But after I let the horses go, they avoided this place. Every single one. Except June. And now they're all here." Nora took a few steps forward and knelt by the spot June had marked. The earth was soft. Recent. Something had been here, or was coming back. Sheriff Ellison cleared his throat. "You think this has anything to do with why they returned?" Jack nodded slowly. "I think they remembered what we chose to forget." The sun had begun to rise, casting long shadows across the pasture. The horses along the fence stirred, their ears perked, as if waiting for something to emerge from the ground itself. And somewhere deep beneath their feet, the land was shifting, just enough to be noticed. By late morning, the pasture was heavy with silence. Sheriff Ellison had called in a deputy and flagged the area, unsure whether they were standing over a historical site or a crime scene no one had dared name for decades. Jack sat on an overturned fence post, head low, hands trembling slightly. The years had worn his body thin, but this was something different. This was the weight of memory turning into something unbearable. Nora stood near the disturbed earth, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She could feel it too. This place wasn't just haunted by the past, it was still speaking. She'd spent her life around animals, trusted their instincts more than most people's opinions. And every part of her was screaming that the horses hadn't returned by accident. They'd been drawn here. "Jack," she said gently, "what exactly do you remember from the day your father had this buried?" Jack didn't look up. He was yelling. Said the land didn't belong to us, said it never really did. He was angry, more than I'd ever seen him. Told me to dig until my hands bled, then told me never to speak of it again. That was the day something broke in him. Nora sat beside him. "What did you find?" Jack closed his eyes. There was a saddle, but it was burned, melted into bone. There was something carved into the leather, letters I didn't recognize. My father tore it from my hands before I could look closer. He said we had to cover it, or they'd come back. "They?" she asked. Jack looked at her now, his voice low and certain. "The herd." It didn't make sense, not in any way the mind could explain. But the land remembered. The horses remembered. And maybe somewhere, Jack had remembered too. June stepped closer and laid her head gently against his shoulder, a touch so familiar it brought tears to his eyes. Sheriff Ellison returned from the edge of the field, his boots caked in fresh soil. "You need to see this," he said. They followed him in silence to a shallow trench where roots had been torn by hooves. Lying there, half exposed, was a rusted horseshoe, massive, old-fashioned, and still warm to the touch. Nora reached for it, hesitated, then pulled her hand back. "This didn't just belong to a horse," she whispered. Jack stared down at the relic, and in that moment he understood. The horses hadn't come to revisit the past. They'd come to finish something that had never ended. Jack knelt by the trench, his fingertips brushing the edge of the old horseshoe. The metal was rough, scarred by time, but still warm, as if it had just come off a horse that had galloped through fire. He looked up at Nora, who stood frozen, her face pale with disbelief. Behind them, the herd remained still, as if held in place by something older than instinct, something sacred. "This isn't just from any horse," Jack said quietly. "My grandfather used to tell stories about a stallion that led wild herds across this land before any fences were built. Said it couldn't be caught, couldn't be broken. He called it the Red One. Said it carried a fire in its eyes and thunder in its lungs." "You think this belonged to that horse?" Nora asked, skeptical, but something in her voice hinted at wonder. Jack nodded. "He said it vanished during a storm that nearly wiped out our family's first herd. After that, nothing grew right here. The animals wouldn't graze. We always thought it was just superstition. But maybe it was something else." Sheriff Ellison crouched beside them, holding up the horseshoe. "This isn't modern. Not even close. Could be pre-Civil War. Maybe older." He turned it in his hands. "There's something carved on the back." They leaned closer. The letters were faint, but visible. Not English. Not Spanish. Nora stepped back. "That's Choctaw," she whispered. "I saw symbols like that in old veterinary records from the reservation. They used to bless their horses before battle." The realization hit Jack like a cold wind. This land hadn't just been owned before his family claimed it, it had been sacred. The burial ground, the bones, the strange pull of the horses, it all pointed to something they'd desecrated generations ago. His father had buried the truth, but the herd had never forgotten. "They're not here for me," Jack murmured. "They're here for what was taken." In the distance, a low rumble echoed through the ground. Not thunder, but hooves. More were coming. The herd began to shift, restless now, sensing the arrival. Jack stood slowly, his eyes following the horizon. "I have to give it back," he said. "Give what back?" Nora asked. Jack looked at the trench. "All of it. The land. The promise. The debt my family never paid." And as the sky darkened with dust from a rising storm of hooves, the past began galloping home, unforgiving, unrelenting, and unstoppable. The ground trembled beneath Jack's boots as more horses crested the distant ridge, their silhouettes bathed in the golden light of a setting sun. Hundreds of them, wild, dust-covered, proud, galloping with purpose. The herd on Jack's property stirred, parting slowly as if making way for something larger, older. June remained still by his side, her breath calm, her eyes fixed ahead. Jack turned toward Nora and Sheriff Ellison, his voice steady, even as his heart pounded like a war drum. "It's not just a memory anymore," he said. "It's alive. And it's coming for closure. What exactly are you going to do?" Ellison asked, watching the dust storm roll closer. Jack didn't answer with words. He stepped into the pasture, unlatched the gate to the burial site, and walked straight to the disturbed earth. He removed his hat, dropped to his knees, and began digging with his bare hands. Dirt flew behind him in frantic handfuls. Every motion tore open more than just soil, it unearthed a legacy of silence. He didn't stop until he found it, the charred remains of a bridle. Beneath it, a wooden talisman, cracked but still intact, wrapped in leather cords. Symbols were carved into its surface, the same Choctaw marks that had been found on the horseshoe. Jack held it in his trembling hands, tears now mixing with the dust on his face. "This wasn't ours to begin with," he whispered. "And we tried to bury what never belonged to us." The wind howled across the pasture, kicking up waves of grass and dust. The returning herd reached the gate but did not enter. They waited, watching. Among them, a single red stallion stood out, tall, lean, and wild-eyed, with a coat that shimmered like embers in the fading light. Its gaze locked with Jack's, and the weight of generations passed between them without a sound. Jack stood slowly, lifted the talisman, and walked toward the gate. The horses parted once more, creating a path that led directly to the red stallion. Jack extended the token, then laid it gently on the ground before him. The stallion stepped forward and bowed its head, touching the object with its muzzle. Then, silence. The herd turned, slowly at first, then in a wave of graceful movement, they began to leave, one by one, in a slow, powerful procession back into the hills, led by the red stallion. Not one looked back, except June. She lingered, eyes on Jack, as if asking a final question. The next morning arrived quiet and golden. The storm of hooves was gone, and the air smelled of earth, freshly turned and somehow cleansed. Jack stood alone in the pasture, the talisman still resting where he'd placed it, untouched. There was no trace of the herd now, only faint hoofprints leading back into the distant hills. But he didn't need proof. He felt it, deep in his chest, in the stillness of the land. Something that had been broken was finally whole again. Nora arrived just after sunrise, carrying a thermos of coffee and an old wool blanket. She didn't say much, just walked up beside Jack and handed him the cup. They stood together in silence, watching the morning dew burn away under the warmth of the sun. For the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel like a burden. It felt right. "She stayed," Nora said finally. Jack turned and followed her gaze. June stood near the barn, alone now, but at peace. Her ears twitched at the sound of their voices, and she let out a soft breath, almost like a sigh. Jack smiled, not with his mouth, but with something in his eyes. A kind of peace he hadn't known he needed. "She came back," he said. "Maybe she always intended to." They walked back to the porch together, boots crunching over gravel and dry grass. Sheriff Ellison had already left, but he'd promised to keep the story quiet, for now. There were things that didn't need explaining, and this was one of them. Some truths were bigger than words, and older than the law. Before going inside, Jack paused and looked out over the ranch. The fences still needed fixing. The barn roof was sagging. There was no herd left to manage. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone here. The land had spoken, and he had finally listened. Nora touched his arm. "What now?" Jack took a slow breath. "Now? I think I start over. Not the ranch. Me." June neighed softly in the distance, a sound full of quiet strength. And as the sun rose over the hills, Jack Rourke stood tall on the porch of a land he finally understood, not as something to own, but as something to honor. What had come home to him hadn't been just the horses. It had been himself.